Today's video is a special one because we're sewing a garment and adding lace embellishment as an extra touch. Using lace hem tape, we can add visual interest to any pattern simply with a little top stitching. This is the Connie V-neck top by Tiana's Closet, a bohemian style blouse with a gathered bodice and bound sleeve hems. I hope you love the end results as much as I do. Let's get sewing. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece, and I'm going to pin my darts. And I'll repeat for both front bodice pieces. I'm going to sew my darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point and tying them in knots. And press your darts downward. Now I'll place my front and back bodice pieces right sides together, matching the shoulder seams and the side seams, and pin in place. I'm going to sew each of these seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and then press them each toward the back of the garment. I'm going to take the neckline binding bias tape and start applying it around the neckline of the bodice, from the bottom edge of the center front to the opposite bottom center front. Place them right sides together and pin in place all the way around. Now I'll sew the binding all the way around from center front to center front with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I'm done sewing, I'll press my seam allowance toward the binding. Here are my front and back bodice pieces opened out apart from each other at the shoulder seam and the side seam. After applying the bias tape, I've pressed the seam and the bias tape away from the garment, and now I'm going to press the bias tape along its main seam to the inside of the garment, and I'm also going to tuck the excess bias tape underneath itself so that the raw edge can be folded underneath, so you have a nice finished edge and a nice clean outer seam. Press that in place all the way around the neckline. So now I have my binding pressed to the inside with the raw edges tucked underneath, and I've pinned everything in place. I did this at the ironing board. Sew the binding in place all the way around from center front to center front, just edge stitching close to the folded edge of the tape on the inside. Now to add some accent around the neckline, I'm just going to use lace hem tape and sew it in place, edge stitching along both outer edges of the hem tape. I'll just place it along that neckline and edge stitch first along the outermost edge all the way around from center front to center front. Then when I'm done with that set of stitches, I'll edge stitch along the innermost edge, once again from center front to center front. Fold your sleeve in half right sides together, matching the underarm seam, and pin in place. Sew this underarm seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together, then you can press them toward the back of the sleeve. Now to prepare to put the sleeve into the armhole, we're going to sew basting stitches around the top of the sleeve from outer notch to outer notch. Use the longest stitch on your machine and make sure you leave tails of thread so you have threads to pull for gathering. Now I'll turn my sleeve right side out and place it right sides together with the bodice at its corresponding armhole. I'll match the underarm seams first and pin in place. Then I'll match the lower notches indicating front and back and pin in place. Now I'll start pulling the basting stitches along the top of the sleeve, and I'll concentrate all of the gathers toward the top of the sleeve. Now I'll match the notch at the top of my sleeve with my shoulder seam and pin in place, then continue pinning the remainder of the sleeve, making sure my gathers are distributed evenly. Now I'll sew to attach the sleeve with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and then press them toward the bodice. Repeat to attach both sleeves. Fold your cuff piece in half, wrong sides together, and give that a good press to form a memory crease. Reopen this cuff piece and fold it right sides together, matching the short edges, and sew the short edges with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Fold your cuff back in half along its memory crease. Then we're going to prepare to attach that cuff to the bottom of the sleeve. First, I'm going to sew basting stitches along the bottom of the sleeve, once again using my longest stitch length. I'm going to start my stitching at the seam, sew all the way around, and stop my stitching on the other side of the sleeve, remembering to leave thread tails on both sides so that we have threads to pull for gathering. Pull those basting stitches to gather the bottom of the sleeve to fit the cuff. Then we'll pin the cuff to the bottom of the sleeve, aligning the raw edges and pinning through all layers, starting at the seam. Then we can sew around the cuff with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and you can press the seam up toward the sleeve. For the cuff, I'll also be using lace to embellish that bottom of the sleeve. I'm just going to center that lace hem tape on top of the cuff, starting at the seam. I'm just going to edge stitch along both edges of the hem tape, just as I did for the bodice neckline. Once I make my way around and I'm back where I started, I'll fold the opposite end of the hem tape back by about 1/4 inch and sew it on top of the opposite raw edge for a clean finish. And repeat the process for the bottoms of both sleeves. Place your front and back lower bodice pieces right sides together and pin both of the side seams. Sew both of those side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press them toward the back of the garment. Now, before we attach the lower bodice to the upper bodice, we're going to baste along the upper raw edges all the way around. I'm going to start at the side seam and baste along the upper edge of the back piece first. And I'll cut my stitches at the opposite side seam, making sure to leave tails of thread at both ends so I have threads to pull for gathering the back bodice. Then for the front piece, I'm going to baste in 2 sections. I'll baste from the side seam to the top of the center front, leaving tails of thread on both ends. Then I'll baste the final section from the top of the center front to the side seam, once again leaving thread tails. I've gone ahead and gathered each section. At this point, I'm going to hem the bottom of the lower bodice pieces. I'm going to do a rolled hem here. I'm going to fold it to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, then once more by an additional 1/2 inch, and give that a good press all the way around. Now that my hem is prepared, I'll go ahead and edge stitch close to the inner fold all the way around. Now, before I attach the upper bodice piece to the lower bodice piece, I want to baste those center front edges together. I'll just butt them up against each other and baste to attach. Place the raw edges of the lower bodice and upper bodice right sides together and start pinning at the side seams, the center back, and the center front. Now we can pull all of the basting stitches so that we have evenly formed gathers all the way around and pin in place. Sew the upper and lower pieces together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, making sure to pivot those stitches at the center front. Then finish the raw edges together and press the seam allowance toward the bottom of the garment. If you like, as a final touch, you could also add lace around the bodice at the seam line all the way around. You can fold the raw edge of your lace to the wrong side by about 1/4 of an inch, and then sew from center front all the way around, folding the raw edge of the opposite end of the hem tape by 1/4 of an inch on the opposite side as well. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.